10 seconds later, and I was in another virtual reality, same as it would be if I had the vibrational state after 20 minutes of practice, and then I was out of body. It was no different. I entered a high fidelity environment, which was as physically real as what I just left. And this is another reason why I think physicality is, nothing more, nothing less than a set of, sort of computations. It tells us this is what physical feels like. So I think psychedelics can be certainly a window into other levels of reality. And I think, DMT, what they call the businessman's LSD, because you can take it 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, and all the effects pretty much are wearing off. It's an interesting thing. Ayahuasca, people have some interesting experiences. I personally prefer the meditative route that I teach, because then you don't need any drugs, you don't have any dependency on finding a source, you are the source. And I think it's just, that the more you can simplify the approach, then the more you're going to get from it. But I think psychedelics is a valid approach to have an experience that might then, inspire you to not use the drugs to experience the same thing. They can be like training wheels. Anybody else?
I've had experiences, I've had out-of-body experiences, but unconsciously or not willingly, they just happened. And I have this feeling sometimes when I'm not dreaming, but I get this feeling somebody's trying to steal my soul out of my body while I've been sleeping, and I get sleep paralysis. And I cannot shout out, like say, it seems like forever I'm shouting before I can get enough noise out to wake myself up. But I always feel like somebody's trying to steal my soul. And it freaks me out.
Okay. You ready for my answer?
I am.
Okay, so first of all, I really feel for what's happening. Okay, because for those of us who have had sleep paralysis, we've all felt like that. I remember the first time it happened to me as a child. I thought something dubious was happening too. And I felt so vulnerable in the wrong kind of way. When I've had ET experiences in the out-of-body state, in that in-between state, and I've literally had, sort of the ET forms standing around me, it makes you feel very, very vulnerable and helpless. And it's not a nice feeling. Now, I would say this, that 99.999% of the time, this is your fear mind being activated and creating thought forms in the moments. That's how strong the fear mind is. On our physical world, the fear mind is more dominant than the loving mind. We literally, to be happy, most of us have to actually think happy thoughts. But we don't have to think about being unhappy. It's become very much an unconscious process. So the fear mind easily activates in these experiences. So I'm telling you from experience, the majority of the time, it is nothing more than your own energy body that you're experiencing, or thought forms that you're experiencing, because the fear mind, a lot of people will experience hallucinations at that time. And these hallucinations are thought forms within another dimension of reality. And it's very easy to mistake it as something else. This is why we have the sort of expression, the old hag syndrome, or succubus, or incubus, and all these different things. Like I said, majority of the time, it is nothing like that at all. So if it's happening to you again and again, it is something that you need to get to terms with while you're awake. It's one of those things where I would say the practice is for you, it's like a meditation. It's come to terms and confronting this before you go back to sleep again, because obviously you feel out of control in that situation. So you do it in a controlled way. You sit down or you lie down and you pretend you're in paralysis, and you pretend this experience is happening again. And in that moment, you remember to be merciful for yourself, compassionate toward yourself, loving toward yourself. And if this is another being, to extend that love outwards. In a lot of cases, when it is an actual psychic attack, a lot of people are still doing this stuff unconsciously. In the moments where people are doing it, where you might think they're doing it deliberately, they're still not what I would say conscious. There's a difference between the loving mind and the fear mind. The fear mind is this unconscious illusion that we create. All the fear that we have in our world. The loving mind is something incredibly different. The fear mind is that part that literally cuts itself off from the reality of love. Makes you feel separate, makes you feel alone, makes you feel helpless. That's not love. So it starts with learning to flex those emotional muscles of self-love. I'm not helpless when this happens. I can shift from fear to love. I can invoke protection. Go out and learn some protection sort of stuff if you really feel that that's something that is for you to do. It can bring a lot of comfort. In those moments, call out to beings that you have a strong connection with. When I grew up in a Christian household, went to Sunday school weekly. Didn't feel much for it, but I loved the stories of Jesus. I loved the stories of this very kind man that seemed to care about people in unfortunate circumstances. I would call in beings like Buddha, Metatron. So now we're getting into some of the spiritual sort of belief systems. But I love the idea. I wasn't always for the idea of angels, but when I'm out of body, beings can take many forms, and we grow through different forms. So these beings are out there to be called in, and time and space is not fundamental. Your consciousness is. So therefore, when you put out a call for help, that thought will penetrate the multidimensional expanse, at the speed of thought, which is instantaneous. So usually when we call out, we can bring forth other positive, loving energies. And I think in those moments where you need that level of comfort, then this is what we practice. So practice it in a controlled way so that when it happens again, you don't feel so out of control. And you might then be able to realize, have enough clarity of mind to say something like, show me the truth of this situation. And then you might suddenly see it vanish. Or it might turn from something menacing into something which is a mirror of you. And it's just your own fear. I think it's important when we're teaching about multidimensional stuff, when we're teaching about the UFO phenomena, we have a great responsibility to remind people we're not helpless. So that's my advice. Anyone else?
Is there a military intelligence that's able to use this against us?
I clocked a couple years ago some very interesting stuff, and it's a very valid question. And who here has heard of Robert Monroe? Put your hand up. Quite a few of you. So Robert Monroe is considered the modern father of out-of-body exploration. He wrote 3 amazing books. He left the legacy of a research institute in America called the Monroe Institute, where they teach people how to have these multidimensional experiences. Back in 1961, a couple years after Robert Monroe started having out-of-body experiences, he was, just like for a lot of people, spontaneous. For me, where it was practiced as an adult, it was spontaneous as a child. For Robert Monroe, at age 39, he started having these spontaneous out-of-body experiences. After a couple of years of getting to grips that he wasn't going crazy and he didn't have a tumor on his brain or something like that, he made peace that this was a natural phenomenon. This is part of who we are. And he reports in one of his 3 books that on this one occasion, he was on business somewhere, and he was in a motel room, and he suddenly thought about, when I come out of body tonight, I'm going to go and visit the president at the presidential compound down the road. Now, he didn't know whether the president would be there. The president at the time, 1961, was John F. Kennedy. So later on, when Monroe came out of his body, he started making his way to the presidential compound, and he was stopped by a non-physical soldier that said, "You can't come onto the compound." And he said, Robert Monroe was like, "I'd like to communicate with the president." And he's like, "The president's not taking visitors right now." And it was really interesting reading that, because I've had very similar experiences where there are non-physical soldiers around key military installations around the planet. Other places that are no-go zones for the general public, like in Antarctica. And as a seasoned out-of-body explorer, I run into this stuff on a regular basis. And when I started teaching remote viewing back in 1999, it was a bit of a wake-up call at the time, realizing that the U.S. military, the Army, the CIA, the former Soviet Union, probably Secret Service here in the UK, they all have their remote viewing programs. And for anybody who's practiced remote viewing for long enough, realizes that whether think you're as psychic as a rock or as tuned in like with a badger sticking his nose in a hornet's nest, you can develop that, because this is all a fundamental for all of us, because all minds are joined on another level. physical reality is not the fundamental. Consciousness is. Consciousness, in my eyes, is what's creating this. It's not the brain. Consciousness is not the phenomena or byproduct of the brain. It's the other way around. So when I was doing the remote viewing stuff and I was having sort of experiences, classically in remote viewing, you don't want to know what the target is. You don't want to be front-loaded. You want to be able to, as much as possible, not analyze the session. I remember, over the years, some of the sessions some of the targets I was given, and then looking at the data afterwards, after the target, and then analyzing it. And the people that you sort of make connections with while in those states. Most times for a majority of remote viewing sessions, you're in an alpha, maybe the alpha-theta border at best. You don't need to go that deep. You just need to sort of get into a clear enough state of mind where you can start to access the signals that are already there. We're talking about a signal-to-noise ratio, reducing the noise to tap into those signals of the target. So after I started having the out-of-body experiences, this was now 6 years on from learning remote viewing and teaching this stuff, and I started having out-of-body experiences, I had a few run-ins while out-of-body in places, military installations, because I had that truth-seeking aspect of me. I wanted to know, are there aliens at Area 51? So of course I'm going to go places, And I ran into what I think, are clearly military personnel who have also got talent to do this. And what's really interesting to me, when you make the connection, if you have a remote viewing program, which in itself is an amazing, technology, and it's an amazing practice. Especially when you look at someone like McMoneagle. What's his first name? McMoneagle, anybody? Doesn't matter. One of the top remote viewers on the planet, Joseph McMoneagle. He's been doing this for well over 40 years. He does live TV demonstrations of this stuff and blows people's minds. And we're not talking about a parlor trick here. We're talking about a very practiced clairvoyant. So it then clicked in my mind, okay, that's a powerful practice. But it's on its own, stacked up against something like the out-of-body state, astral projection, whereas in remote viewing without biolocation, where you're sort of forming another physical form in another dimensional reality or another within this physical reality. Beyond biolocation, in most remote viewing, practices, the data is being filtered to you. So it's not a very interactive experience. In the out-of-body state, it's a highly interactive experience. You can go places. You can go places in the blink of an eye, just literally thinking about being somewhere, and you can be somewhere if your clarity is strong enough. You can have some unconscious stuff that can spin you out and take you somewhere else, but with enough practice, you can go where you want to go. So it made a lot of sense to me that if the out-of-body state is achievable by everyday people like us, people who just spontaneously have experience, who's had experiences? Put your arm up. Look around you. That's at least 15% of the room has had probably conscious, if not spontaneous experiences. I teach this stuff. I teach it over the period of a couple days to 9 days, depending on the course. Majority of the people that come on the course, if they practice, within days of being there, they'll have an experience, or within weeks of going home, if they practice, they will have an experience. I'm teaching this with basically very little budget. Now you take covert science. We have mainstream science and we have covert science. Covert science has access to, they can be totally obscure, no oversight whatsoever. Billions, potentially billions of dollars, and potentially reverse engineered technology. What can they achieve in the out-of-body state that I currently am marginally, sort of tapping into as one individual? There was one case in particular where I bumped into personnel who were out of body, and they made it very clear to me that they had their own technology that they've developed to help people enter the out-of-body state within minutes. Me and my team, we've developed what Rachel was talking about, Pandora's Star, which is designed, from a consciousness explorer's perspective. We know, for example, lucid dreaming is a particular cocktail of frequencies. We know it's REM sleep, which is, the theta and the alpha frequencies, also with the theta driving a gamma wave, a 40 hertz gamma wave. That's a hybrid state of REM. You cannot have conscious dreaming without 40 hertz gamma. So with our machine, we can run up to 4 frequencies simultaneously. We can pretty much tap anywhere from 0.1 hertz, which is a sub-delta frequency, down to epsilon, all the way up to over 200 hertz, which is currently the highest recorded human brainwave. So if you get the combinations right, you can pretty much hit any aspect of human consciousness and beyond. It's getting the frequency cocktail correct. And if you think, if they have their multi-million pound remote viewing programs, why would they not have multi-million pound out-of-body exploration programs? They have the technology, they have the funds, they have to do it in darkness, without oversight from Congress, the Senate, or any other government. It exists, it's there. But I would also say, when we look at subjects like this, if we just look in a fearful way, we're not really doing very much. We're just adding more fear to the equation. I think whenever we look at something like this, we have to look with depth. We have to, again, look with love and realize, how can I help this situation become more loving for humanity? So I think I love doing the truth-seeking stuff, but I personally feel nowadays it has to be done with love. It cannot just be done with fear. Fear will just create more fear. We have to do it with love. In whatever way you can do that personally, we do it with love.
Have you found any evidence that we're in a loose farm and we're being farmed for our energy?
Loosh is a...
Across the archons.
Sure. Loosh is a term that I first came across with Robert Monroe. It was written about in his second book, Far Journeys. So if you want to learn a bit about Loosh, Robert Monroe had a very sort of testing experience with this idea that we have been created kind of like portrayed in the film Jupiter Rising, yes? So when you learn of something like Loosh and then you see it portrayed in a Hollywood film, and then you take someone like Robert Monroe, people who have studied the out-of-body state give this guy a lot of credibility, and he deserves it.
The Gnostics as well. That's
Yes. And I personally think that human history is not quite black and white. Certainly not as religion would tell us. I think we were seated here. But again, I don't have the belief that this is a physical reality that retains exclusivity over the solidness of physicality. I personally think this is a virtual system. And I think we're used to operating in virtual systems as these very dynamic souls. I think it's just that we fall into spiritual amnesia and we forget. And that, some would say that's part of the process of existing here, because otherwise you're left with all your filters wide open, remembering your multidimensional lifetimes that are taking place, in synchrony with your current life. Because to me, your soul is experiencing all this simultaneously. To us, we have this conditioning of linear time. We have a particular time and space domain that our consciousness, our awareness is locked into. I think the idea of Lush, it doesn't sit outside the bounds of what I've sort of seen, nor does it sit outside the bounds of my belief system. But again, I say if you're going to approach a topic like that, you have to approach it in a way as to say, what can I as an individual do about this? Because if we're just spreading information without actually doing something to, sort of make amends in that situation, what are we doing? We're literally just spreading information. And as much as I like spreading information, I also like spreading tools that people can use to verify stuff. Reminders that we are not helpless children. We're adults. The government wants us to feel like helpless children, but we are not helpless children. And I think the more that we strengthen our emotional muscles, our mental muscles, we can start making a profound difference in this world. And I think it's our responsibility to do so. I think it is a valid idea. I don't like the idea that potentially there's an aspect of our energy being used. But I've seen our energy used in profoundly loving ways. And that's the way I prefer it. Just because a system is created and designed in a particular way doesn't mean that, once the simulations wake up to it, that we have to continue to be controlled by old programming. This is a matter of updating, how you believe. Learning to shift from an unloving feeling to a loving feeling. Remembering that you have personal power when you shift from fear to love. So yeah, I subscribe to the idea, but I think that if you're aware of the idea, it's come to you for a reason.
And do you think we could be being recycled back in the reincarnation loop system?
I think the reincarnation loop system is self-enforced. Most of us, the actions that we sort of, the thoughts and the feelings and the beliefs that we hold inspire every action that we take. We have a responsibility to clean up our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions that are going to literally create every behavior, every action. And I think if we think that there's any spiritual tradition on this planet that gives you a free pass from working on your stuff, doing the inner work, you're literally, when you die, you're going to find a mirror of the actions that you've made on this level. When people talk about the soul catcher idea, which I think you're alluding to, personally I think it's disgusting. I think it's a disgusting idea. Because we've already had enough religious abuse. We don't need spiritual abuse to go on top of that. When I was a young boy and I went to Sunday school and I had a man preaching that if I did this or I did that, I was going to hell, and that when I went into the light after death, I would have my final judgment. Can you imagine certain people, on death, going over to the other side, seeing light, even if it's an energy tunnel to another level? It's not to judgment. What are they going to think if they have a strong spiritual belief? If I go into the light, I'm going to have my final judgment. What if they feel they were a bad person? What are they going to do? They're not going to go into the light, and they're going to get stuck in what religion calls limbo. They're going to get stuck in that intermediate environment like those other individuals got stuck, not because they were conscious of it, but because, they were focused on that. They didn't have a strong afterlife belief system. But I think, like religious abuse, we can have spiritual abuse, and we need to be very mindful of the ideas that we spread. If you're going to spread an idea, if you're going to talk about an idea, talk about solutions too. You can't just talk about the idea in a fearful way. You have to talk about it in a loving way. And that means giving people tools, giving people solutions. To me, reincarnation is a regular cycle of life. And it's usually generated because, I've witnessed for myself, when people die here, they go to other environments, and in most cases, they are not forced to come back here. They're literally given the opportunity to literally create a higher state of consciousness for themselves in that life. And if they don't, they do get recycled back here. That is usually that self-governed, system that's in operation. When we start taking full responsibility for all our thoughts, feelings, and actions, we will not continue to get cycled back into this level. Reality is not black and white, where we are being purely manipulated by others. When we are manipulated, it is because we are not being responsible for ourselves. And it is clear, it is literally that clear. It is about taking personal responsibility, and I mean 100%. That doesn't mean hanging out at like 95, 96% responsibility. Patterns don't shift when there's still 4% left to work on. The inner work is important for all of us to do.
You kind of answered it already, but it's similar to what the gentleman in the blue show was talking about. Sometimes when I enter the out-body state, it's like...
Can you just speak up a bit, please?
Sorry, sometimes when I enter the out-body state, it's like dark beings, what this lady calls the archons, what Islam calls the jinns, loads of different names for them. It's almost like they're attaching themselves to me and draining my energy. Some people that I research, they say there's projection of my own fear. Other people say these beings are actually have their own kind of ecological distinction. Obviously my mum thinks I'm insane, So it's just kind of, how do you prevent it from happening? And how do you know if it's an actual being or projection of my own fear?
I think, to me, on a sort of on one level, there is no difference. Because one way or another, you are literally at the mercy of fear, whether it's somebody else's or your own. So to me, there is no distinction. To me, it still comes to the point where, are you approaching the situation in a loving way? And what I mean by that is self-love. What am I doing about it in a positive way? Am I sort of just aware of it and I do nothing about it and then just continue to allow it to happen? Or what am I doing about it? I can confirm from my own experiences. I've been manipulated by other beings while in the out-of-body state, and therefore in the in-body state, the incarnate state. And my life is profoundly shifted when I started taking responsibility for everything that showed up in my life. And I think this is one of the keys. This is why, you know, some people prosper and some people don't. If you're in the sort of blame and judgment game, you're going to experience a mirror of that. That's fear. And what do you think that fear is going to drive? It's going to drive a fearful situation. And there's no sort of master of reality out there that's forcing you to experience that. I honestly think this is a very self-governed system.
Have you got any suggestions on how to quicken the process of self-love? I mean, quite embarrassing. I was a drug addict for many years, so I didn't really understand self-love until I kind of got clean and turned my life around. So it's all very new to me.
Well, one of the first things you're doing right now is the first step, which is realizing you can't do this on your own. You know, this is why alcoholics go to Alcoholics Anonymous, because they know they can't do it on their own. And I don't think healing is any different. I don't think doing that shadow work is any different. I think, you know, you need to literally be able to be vulnerable enough to say, look, I can't do this on my own. And then it's at that point then you start to get help, either from physical beings or non-physical beings. But literally it's your decision to whether you get help or not. And I can clearly see that you want to quicken the process, like you say. You want to start taking responsibility, and you've taken the first step to do that, you know, to reach out. So my suggestion is that, you know, you first try to understand as much as you possibly can. You also realize that everything that comes into your life probably came into your life for one, you know, reason or another, whether it's your own thinking. You know, we're dealing with multidimensional reality here. We're also dealing with your other parallel lifetimes that are taking place. You know, this is a lot of energy. And it's the more you can sort of become aware of this stuff without getting sort of consumed by it in the sense of the fearful side of it, look at it with depth. Why is this being coming to me? You know, try to understand, you know, from the other side too. You know, like with Theresa May as an example. You know, up until the election, I was struggling hard. Kept hitting that wall, wondering how, you know, my feelings towards Theresa May, which were very negative. And I was thinking, you know, why am I struggling so much when I hear her speak or you know, sort of manage this you know, sort of election campaign with rented crowds or whatnot. You know, I just couldn't come to terms with why she didn't want to be on TV with Jeremy Corbyn or whatever. You know, I don't want to get too political here. And then I remembered, I said, you know, me hitting this wall, this is where I'm being shown where I have a lack of love in this area. A lack of love for a compassion for another human being. Like the previous speaker, you know, said, you know, are we aware, do we have this intimate awareness of how Theresa May is being controlled within this system? You know, what have they got on her? You know, what kind of rituals has she been involved in to deeply seed herself and connect herself into this that she now can't get out of, or finds it difficult to get out without pulling the plug on her own life? And then that doesn't really get her out of it because, you know, there's going to be a cause and effect operating across the whole system. So I think the more that we literally start realizing that taking responsibility, and we're coming to an end here. Okay. Okay, look, I'm out of time. I've got my cards here. Send me an email, and I'll send you everything that, you know, I can possibly send you for you to start making the recovery in this area. Okay? I think that's really my time.
Can you just give a minute just to talk about the Pandora, if you want to, the Pandora
Okay.
Spa?
We have a spa down in London, which, you know, is open 7 days a week. It's a mind spa. It's so much more than I can describe right now. We have one deck, which is probably about the size of this, but kind of rectangular instead of cut off corners. And we've built some very powerful transducers on the bottom of the deck. We have a sort of a surround sound system built around it. We have some amazing gongs, and we have 10 light machines, the Pandora Star light machines, suspended above the deck. We can run where we have 10 people in session at a time. Everyone can run on their own particular session with their own frequency choice, or we can run 10 people for a group session of the same frequencies. Our technology, if somebody comes to us feeling stressed, anxious, depressed, jet-lagged, PMS, you know, Alzheimer's, you name it, we've got programs that can, you know, whatever, the way we look at this, every state of being has a frequency associated with it. Let's take, for example, stress and anxiety. This is a high beta wave. It's not, you know, a normal sort of healthy brainwave state. Depression is a delta frequency associated with deep delta, which is associated with sleep. It's a deep rejuvenation sleep frequency. these are an imbalance of brain waves. So having that sort of knowledge, we can build programs that can help bring balance to people. So for well-being states, we use the light for cognitive enhancement. So there's one program that I use almost daily. It's 40 hertz frequency gamma. Increased cognitive function for increased memory, increased brain processing speed. Using this one program 15 minutes a day for, say, 2 months, you'll minimum increase your brain processing speed by about 8%. Your brain will literally restructure under this frequency. It's powerful. We also use the light for very exotic states of exploration, such as with lucid dreaming and out-of-body exploration. It's wonderful technology, but I promise you, in comparison to government technology, it looks like a toy. But it's still quite powerful. And I definitely invite you down. You can take a card and you can find me on Facebook. That's the best way to contact me. But yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk, Todd. That's fascinating, so much in there. And I like the idea of personal responsibility. There's a contact list just there on the table by that back door if you're interested, and we can get a collective group together to go down if you're interested, and I'll keep you posted. So we've now got a bit of a break for, we'll give it 15 minutes, we'll come back at 20 to 5, and when we come back we then have a delight. We have half an hour set of music from Dave Hunt, and what are you calling yourself, Paranautics, is that right?
Well, just Dave Hunt.
I'll call you Dave Hunt, okay. Yeah, it's just I've got that on Facebook. Okay, so yeah, acoustic rock band, lead singer of Cosmosis and solo singer Dave Hunt. So come back in 15 minutes please, thank you.